IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Ganatantra podcast. I am Alok Prasanna Kumar.
And I am Sarayu Natarajan.
In this episode, we're going to do something different. We don't generally talk about ourselves. We are going to talk about our work, or more specifically, Sarayu's work. Sarayu has just finished her thesis on political intermediaries in Bangalore, and who probably, when you're listening to this, is probably on stage getting her doctorate from King's College. And given all that we have discussed and talked about, we thought, one area that we haven't covered is the one closest to home, which is literally in Bangalore, and what Sarayu has studied. So we thought this would be an issue that possibly might interest a lot of you, and we should have a discussion about it. Without any further ado, so Sarayu, tell us what your thesis is about.
Well, it is about quite a lot of things, but very specifically, I looked at the ways in which political intermediaries, and I think the literature calls them various things: brokers, leaders, agents, fixers. There's kind of a range of terms that's used. How do they strategize to earn and secure vote bases? I looked at, just a context in Bangalore, and I looked at, a set of brokers, worked with them over a period of time to understand this question. I then did a slight extension, and this is on I guess, more from the perspective of trying to understand impact on electoral politics itself, sort of using a micro theory to look at a broader context. I looked at how political parties within Bangalore, particularly the BJP, which has seen some growth over the last decade or so, how do they make inroads into urban areas? Because a lot of that is built on the belief that they make entry through neoliberal urban elites. But I complicate that a little bit with my research in the context of using the context of housing.
So political intermediaries, right? I mean, the term, usually most of us use the term broker for somebody who finds us a house or somebody who gets us something done, usually with the government and so on. The other, of course, being marriage brokers. But who are these people? Like, let's get down to where will you find them? What do they do? And how do they become who they are? And where do they go from there? That's actually one of the most interesting things.
Sure. I think brokers are somebody that most people have encountered in their lives at some point of time when you needed to get something done.
Yeah.
I think we call them by different terms. I think the local term here in Bangalore seems to be leader, which is applied to a range of intermediaries who do different kinds of things, but the term used is leader. Broker is a term that's used in the literature because of the role of intermediation that they play. But I think it's anybody who's political, who's helping you liaise with the state, could be defined as a broker. I mean, brokers play a range of other functions as well, but that relationship between you and the state being mediated by that individual, that is a broker. Now, it's obviously something that's been a hotbed of much debate within political science itself, but it seems like there are two clear strands around how brokers are imagined and their role is sort of understood. One is the idea that they intermediate between you and the state, and they help the poor or the disadvantaged cite the state in some sense. Anirudh Krishna, in his book Active Social Capital, calls these individuals Naya Netas. So there is an element of leadership and sort of leading groups of people to access the state in it. Stuart Cobridge calls it citing the state. It's Stuart Cobridge and a few others, but they call it citing the state. The idea that the state is invisible to the poorest citizen and that there is this individual who's helping you see that state. So that's one imagination of the broker. And there are, different subtypes within these. Some of these distinctions are artificial and they mostly are used to set up arguments and sort of unpack them. But there is sort of the social worker, the broker who plays a social role where his work is primarily as a karyakarta or somebody who serves society. And then there is somebody who is more political in his leanings in the sense that he is appointed by a political party to help individuals access the state. So this is kind of in the role of intermediation, there are different kinds of brokers. There's the other, which is also a fairly long literature. Some of the recent work around it is by Susan Stokes and a couple of others, where they look at specifically brokers setting up quid pro quo exchanges, which is you give something in exchange for a vote. It's a fairly atomized view of political relationships. But that is another understanding of political intermediation, where the central fact or the imaginary is the election, where you win the election or lose the election based on the votes aggregated by the broker. And that is done through offering goods or resources to voters on the ground, who on the basis of receipt or the promise of receipt cast their vote for a political party. So it's an old system. It's a system that we've all encountered in different senses at different points of time, but something that's a subject of quite a lot of debate within the academy.
So that's very interesting, because I think the specific good that you've looked at is housing, right? And we've had all these various schemes, especially for urban housing. You had this Indira Awas Yojana, and now you have the Pradhan Mantri. It's become over the years Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, and I suppose that's only one kind of good. But why do you choose housing for us specifically?
It's very interesting. I think there's a range of goods that are given as public goods because from the state through welfare programs. Housing is one of those that's very core and basic to individuals' identity within the city. If you look at it from the perspective of the migration literature, one element of belonging is, or one element of permanence, and interviewees and respondents would say Kayam, or permanent in the city. Life is Kayam when you get a house. Right. So housing has an emotive or a psychic appeal beyond sort of the obvious material concerns that it looks at. The other is, of course, housing is not a private good. So you can't, but it's given by, it's not a good, it's not something that you can do on your own. Like you have to have some kind of the state grants rights over land upon which property is built. So there's a foundational element to it which involves the state. And the state can never be disintermediated from the process, despite having the Republic of Whitefield as a unique entity with its own flag. It is still the land of the state. And so I think, that puts it at a unique position. I don't want to over-essentialize, but I think also there is, in the process of research, I spent a considerable amount of time, and that speaks a little bit to the methods that I used in my dissertation research. But I spent a considerable amount of time in the field context, where I found two areas neighboring each other, separated by the stopping of the grant of housing rights by the state. So one part, sometime in the 80s, there was a grant of Hakkupatres, which are housing rights documents, I guess, that capture some kind of right. And just across, literally like 5 or 10 feet across a narrow road, there's no housing rights. And local histories did not suggest any particular reason why that grant of housing rights stopped. But that presented a very interesting comparative context, because while they were served by the same set of political intermediaries, while the local institutions or the local street level bureaucracy was the same, it was the same BWSSB, the same BESCOM, the same set of organizations, yet political relations was very different. So it kind of naturally also suggested itself.
So in what way were those political relations different? Like did those houses which had been given to them, the people who lived there have a very different relationship with the state? I suppose, and I'm taking a guess here, is that they were probably approximately the same socioeconomic strata?
Yes, and they come from they're old migrants into Bangalore, older migrants into Bangalore.
Approximately.
Who have 40, 50 years ago. They were all moved from a similar part of the city in some slum rehabilitation and quote-unquote cleanup drives that happened in the mid-70s, I think, coinciding with the visit, in fact, of Indira Gandhi, but I couldn't time that in perfectly. But so there's commonality, and the data shows that. The sociological data shows that the religious breakups are similar. The sociological compositions are similar. So that is something that remains similar across, but it seems like there was a sudden stoppage of the grant of
and so how, just to go back to that original question, so how did the relation of the set of people who got the grants, how was their relationship with the state different from those who didn't get those grants?
Sure, and I think that's kind of the crux of my thesis, is what I explore empirically. In the area where there is access to secure housing, political intermediaries, and then, I must point out before we get into some of the details around this, is political intermediaries themselves, like brokers would say, this is different from this area. We see ourselves as being different in both of these areas. In one area, we see ourselves doing X, and in another area, we see ourselves doing Y. In the area where voters have access to secure housing rights, that is in areas where they have the Hakkupatre, voters are much more likely to consider issues of service. So did you deliver the water that was promised to me? And local issues of service delivery are very, very important. So around utilities, there's a lot of negotiation around the grant of identity cards and documents that allow you to access welfare. These are all considerations that are important. There are also narratives of local development, which is that, this broker was responsible for bringing a road to this place, or he brought a street light. And these are narratives that sort of seep in. There's also macro narratives. And I think I must say that this was done between 2015 and 2016, so post the 2014 elections. So the narratives of development also appeared in this context. And therefore, brokers see themselves as needing to serve these citizens by providing goods, by providing services like public goods, by providing public services, access to utilities, mediating with the state when necessary. There's also narratives of, they're not grateful for what we do. And they make up their own minds. Okay. See how much I have done, but they don't vote for me. So the imagination is that of a political party representative serving the citizens. Correspondingly, on the voters' side, voters would say, I've elected him, so it's his job to do this. And if he doesn't, I'm going to vote for somebody else. That narrative also exists. What that means in terms of voter responsiveness or voter behavior is that voters are willing to change their vote to another political party if it credibly offers a promise of providing the goods and services that they desire. So somebody else comes by and says they're very happy to shift. But they will not shift, or they will not be loyal to a political party for any reason. Whereas if you go across, that is in what I in my thesis call the Nala area, because there is a big Nala that sort of runs right through this settlement, voters are completely different. It's the same set of brokers, but brokers will say, I am fairly sure that if I promise housing, I'm going to get 80% of the votes here. Look, our work here is about making sure that we get the identity documents prepared so that residents here can apply for the MLA Development Fund in order to build houses. Correspondingly, voters are also willing to attach their loyalty to the credible promise of housing, right? Which means that if another political party offers the promise of, if the broker or the individual offers the promise of housing and he switches, they're willing to switch their vote with him as well. So the responsiveness is very different. Loyalties are much more entrenched in areas where there's secure housing, because if somebody has served the place for a very long time, there is a loyalty that gets built up. Correspondingly, if there has been a failure of service provision, there's willingness to switch. Whereas here, it's just centered on housing. And I look at this quantitatively as well through a survey.
That's a fascinating finding that you make, because that to me explains a very puzzling pattern in Bangalore voting. We have found, and if you just look at the last few years, Lok Sabha and Assembly elections, there's no overlap between them. You find that in the Assembly elections, you have Congress doing about as well, if not better than the BJP in Bangalore. In terms of the 28 seats, they're approximately 12, 13, 15, something like that. Whereas in the Lok Sabha, the BJP always tends to sweep Bangalore. But interestingly, in the Assembly elections, there's a very clear Congress area of Bangalore and a very clear BJP area of Bangalore. And the periphery is the BJP area of Bangalore, and the core of Bangalore, the central parts of the city. Broadly, for those who have a rough idea of the map of Bangalore, the central parts of the city seem largely a Congress area of Bangalore. I wonder if, my initial thought of it is that maybe what you just said shows that the Congress has done a great job of providing these brokerage services in the central part, but the BJP has done a much better job in the peripheries, where the newer migrants have come and settled.
Absolutely, and that's something that I explore in my thesis as well. So if you look at metrics, and these are problematic, and you know why they are problematic. If you look at average distance of the winning assembly constituency from the center of the city, it's an arbitrary center, you say the GPO is the center, right?
Yes.
The BJP wins more in the peripheries, and the average distance of the Congress winning seat is closer to the center. That's true of municipal elections as well. So in municipal elections in 2010 and 2015, the BJP did better in the peripheries than it did in the center. If you in fact look at Lok Sabha breakdowns, I think I haven't looked at them in detail, but there is some evidence to suggest that the Congress does better in this. I mean, even in the assembly segments, the Congress does better in the central areas of the city. And this has to do with older areas of patronage, though the BJP is making inroads into these, but these are older relationships of between political workers, MLAs, and citizens, which have been established over time through the provision of various goods and services, housing in the first instance, because that is something that cements loyalty and very long-term relationships. Similarly, BJP does better in the peripheries. Now, there are it can't just be attributed to a strategy of instrumental aggregation around housing. None of these are zero-sum games, but there is some suggestive evidence to think about. One is the political party strategies themselves. And this is something that must be understood right in the beginning, because if you look at the party organization, or at least the party organization at the time that I studied it, the Congress has Bangalore as a unit. So there is an MLA who is in charge of Bangalore, or a minister who's in charge of Bangalore, and that person looks at elections within Bangalore at the assembly level. Whereas the BJP follows Bangalore city and a Bangalore district model. The Bangalore city is the inner constituencies, which are closer to the center of the city, typically where the Congress wins. And Bangalore district is the outer 14 constituencies where the BJP has had, it's been mixed, but the BJP has had much more success at the assembly level. So party organization itself is a clue to where they are imagining their strength. But there's another interesting sort of way to think about this. And I did this by looking at municipal elections between 2010 and 2015. Some of the changes in the party organization were affected during that period, so it might be capturing that, but it might also be capturing other variables. So I'm very hesitant in saying that this is definitive proof. But what happened was, what I did was I looked at the probability of a BJP win correlated with distance. So the probability of a BJP win increased with distance from the center of the city. What was also positively correlated in 2010 what was negatively correlated in 2010 was the proportion of unauthorized households at the ward level. But in 2015, it was the opposite.
Oh, interesting.
Right? Suggesting that the BJP had followed a strategy of bringing on board voters who were in unauthorized housing, whose votes were managed or sort of related to a political intermediary or a broker in that area. So what the BJP might have done, and I saw that unravel in my own fieldwork site, where a person who was formerly of the Congress moved over to the BJP after party conversations. What really seemed to have happened at some scale was that the BJP was able to reach out to these intermediaries and bring them on board in order to also shift the voters that came with them. Because if the BJP won, they promised they promised housing, which allowed voters to actually shift. So those loyalties are very entrenched around individuals rather than the party or broader notions of service.
So, which is very interesting, because as we are recording this, there's huge chaos in Karnataka over the fact that MLAs are shifting parties on a day-to-day basis. It's, as a lot of articles have pointed out, this is not like a one-off thing. This has been happening in Karnataka for the last 40 years. And I think what you just said perfectly explains it. Karnataka seems to be in some post-ideological phase in its politics, where the individual, like the one who can guarantee you access to the state, is who you vote for than which party they're from. And it's their personal proclivity which party they prefer to be in. And that might explain the fact that MLAs are fairly confident that if I today shift from the Congress to the BJP, or in some future time for BJP to the Congress, I will not lose a big chunk of my voters, because they'll be like, oh, sure, as long as you can keep the money and the goods flowing from the government, we're okay with it.
Yeah, that's offered as an explanation for why political individuals switch parties. It's also the explanation for why political parties go after individuals in order. So, for instance, before the 2018 Karnataka elections, some 7 or 8 members of the JDS joined the Congress a few weeks before the election. They had mixed success, but they did. And the idea or the notion is that they carry with them their vote banks or vote bases. That is true, and I think I wouldn't wager a guess with respect to all of India or even all of Karnataka. It is true in Bangalore to some extent, at least as the data appears to show. I don't see why it would not be true in other contexts. In fact, in urban contexts, particularly with the importance of housing, it offers an instrument by which political parties can secure vote bases. So then it becomes about the individual and not about the party necessarily. But, as the academic side of me is like, this is probably not the universal truth, and it needs to be complicated. But that is indeed an important way to think about why politics in India is fairly individual driven. And that's definitely true. Yes.
Which brings me to the next thing. Has similar studies or some similar kind of research been carried out in other cities? And the reason why I ask is this kind of patronage-based systems. I think there are local variations to this, and in each city it's worked on a slightly different way. I mean, in Calcutta, for instance, it's one party or nothing. Right? That seems to have been the model in the last 30, 40 years. But another case of clearly BJP areas and Congress areas was Delhi. And that was magnificently disrupted in 2013 and 15 by the Aam Aadmi Party. I wonder is there any other model for other cities where you've had this kind of a system work? Is there any research or any insight into how it's worked?
There is research in other contexts outside of India.
Okay.
There is research in Turkey, for example, that looks at housing, and the Gaikondu, I want to say, is the term for large informal settlements and the politics around it, some of which is based on this. I think Alicia Holland does some work around this in the context of, I want to say, Lima, but I could be wrong about this. But her work is also about urban informality and how political parties enforce evictions in areas where they think that the voters would support them. They enforce informality, but if they believe that not enforcing local rules around informality get them votes, they choose not to. So there are variants of this study that are different, done in different contexts. I am not personally aware of any study that's been done in the Indian context, but the lever of housing, which is sort of from the policy perspective a significant challenge in urban areas. If you think about vast rural to urban migration, if you think about how cities are changing, it could suggest itself as an interesting lever by which political parties may bring onto their fold voters. But this doesn't answer like other questions, right? That are like other explanations that might be more proximate in a specific context. So is the Aam Aadmi Party the explanation for its success? It might not be an instrumental concern, but the hope that social movement delivered to voters. It might be that in Calcutta that there is a completely different lever that operates. So it's hard to say that it is universally true and explains all outcomes in all urban areas, but it offers an explanation in certain contexts. In context of informality, in urban peripheries, do certain political parties that structure themselves according to this earn votes? I would say the answer is quite possibly yes.
And which also, I suppose, in a way, leaves open the possibility that this is something which is capable of being disrupted. That this may not be the only way in which politics in the urban areas are carried out, and potentially there might be somebody who can come up and offer something better.
100%, and this is not a zero-sum game. It's not like if you as a political party, you as the BJP, you go to and do this, I can't do the very exact same thing as another opposing party, right? So a lot of it also depends on organizational capability and strength and the precision of implementing this particular approach. The other is it also sits and has to be seen in context with other strategies followed by other political parties. Whether it is a question of narrative, whether it is the rise or sort of the how do I put it? Like the rise of other forms of civic activism, which also have political outcomes, through the RWA coalitions or whatever else, where large groups of voters vote for a certain kind of political party, whatever that be. So it's not like it's undisruptible. It also has to be put in the context of the first past the post system. So it's really about aggregating enough voters to beat your next closest contestant. So it's hard to say that this is the one strategy, but it is something that might offer an explanation for political change in contexts that are similar, which is true of large parts of India.
That's right. And I think on that note, we shall end this particular episode. Thank you, Sarayu. We've had some variant of this discussion in bits and pieces over the last year or so, but it's great to have all of this together, and wishing you all the best for getting your PhD degree from King's College.
Well, I've got my visa, and I think that was
I think that's the
hardest exam I've done in my life. So if anybody's applied for a UK visa, you would know.
You would know, exactly. So before we close, a couple of notes. We will be taking a hiatus for about a month or so because we'll be coming back with a fresh set of 25 or so episodes. And we want to take this time to properly plan and record and have a brand new content for you. We will be back in September. So you're hearing this probably in the beginning of August. So we'll be back in the first week of September with a fresh set of episodes.
Some of them on themes that might be of interest, themes that we've heard from our listeners in terms of what they would like to hear. But if you have additional feedback or things that you would like to hear, do email us at ganatantrapodcast@gmail.com or tweet us at Ganatantra P.
Yes. So thank you all for tuning in. We hope you have had a good time listening to us. We'll see you soon and you'll hear from us soon in about a week, in about a month.
And please watch our Twitter handle for updates. We'll let you know when the next episode drops.
Yeah. Thank you and see you soon.
And have a good August.
Bye-bye.
Filter coffee is a fascinating beverage. You need to pick the right beans, blend them in the right proportion, roast them to perfection, and slow brew at the right temperature to get the perfect cup. Which is exactly like great conversations as well. You need to track down the most interesting minds, get them into their zone, and settle down for an unhurried, unscripted chat. And coffee for me is always, always, always best enjoyed with friends. I'm Karthik Nagarajan, and do share my table as I meet some of the most interesting people I know and sit them down for a strong cup of coffee and an even stronger conversation. Join me every Wednesday for a freshly brewed episode. This is not frappe. This is the Filter Coffee Podcast.
The most engaging and the most useful conversations you may have in your life are likely to be with your most challenging customers. Hi, I'm Ambi Parmeshwaran, and on this podcast, I will take you through my book, Sponge: Leadership Lessons I Learned from My Clients. Packed with real stories about real people, but most of all, packed with the innumerable lessons I soaked up from some of the most iconic business leaders like Ratan Tata, Azim Premji, S. Ramadorai, Karsanbhai Patel, M. Damodaran, Dr. Kurian, and many more. Don't forget to tune in to the Sponge podcast. Keep sponging to keep learning.